Your nervous system produces the word sorry before you have consciously decided to say it. That is not politeness. That is a threat response. And every time it fires, for asking a question, for needing something, for existing at a slightly inconvenient angle in someone else's hallway, the people receiving it feel not warmth, but something closer to unease. Which means the reflex you have been using for years to hold relationships together, to keep the air in the room safe, to make sure people don't pull away, has been quietly, reliably working against you. Take a slow breath. We have time. And somewhere in the second half of this, there is a finding about what happens to the word sorry when it is said too many times. Something specific that the people around you may already be registering without being able to name it. But before we get there, there is something to understand about what happens in your body in the seconds before an automatic sorry forms. Something that fires faster than thought. That part changes everything about who you have been blaming for this. The word sorry is one of the first things most of us learn to say. Before we understand its full meaning, we learn its function. We learn it smooths things over. We learn it makes the tension in a room drop. We learn that when someone's face shifts into that specific flatness of mild displeasure, the fastest path out is the word. It works. The relief is immediate and real. And if you are someone who learned that lesson early enough and thoroughly enough, the word stopped requiring a reason. It became a reflex, a kind of verbal genuflection. You say it the way you might clear your throat, not because something needs to be cleared, but because that is simply what your body does when certain conditions arise. For a long time, the explanation was simple. Some people were raised more politely than others. Some were more sensitive, more aware of how they affected the people around. Them, women in particular, were understood to apologize more because they were more communally oriented, more attuned to social harmony. The chronic apologizer was, in this framing, simply a person who cared. Perhaps a little too much, but caring. It is a comfortable explanation. It casts the habit in a warm light, and it is, according to the research, almost entirely wrong. In 2010, psychologist Karina Schumann, then at the University of Waterloo, set out with colleague Michael Ross to examine whether the accepted story about apologizing was actually true. They asked participants to keep daily diaries of every offense they committed and every apology they offered. What they found was not what anyone expected. You apologize more, not because you are more empathetic or more concerned with others' feelings. You apologize more because you are more likely to register your own actions as having caused harm. Not because you are more attuned to the pain in the room, because you are more suspicious of your own behavior. You scan yourself more harshly. You hold yourself to a lower threshold for what counts as something requiring a sorry. There is something worth sitting with inside that finding. You are not watching others more carefully. You are watching yourself. And what you see, more often than not, is cause for alarm. There is a detail about what that means neurologically, about what is actually happening in the body in the moments before the word leaves your mouth, that we are going to come back to. It changes the whole picture. Think about where you first learned to apologize. Not the first time you said the word. The first time you learned it was safer to say it than not to. Because that moment usually lives inside a relationship, early, close, and with someone whose mood felt like weather you had to read before you could breathe normally. Most people who apologize compulsively did not simply decide to be this way. The research on this pattern is consistent. It almost always begins in a specific kind of environment, one where someone else's emotional state felt genuinely consequential to your safety, and where, at some point, you discovered that you could influence that state before it turned. In 2013, psychotherapist and complex trauma specialist Pete Walker named what he had been observing across years of clinical work. In his book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, Walker identified a fourth survival response alongside the three most people know: fight, flight, freeze, and a fourth, fawn. Walker described fawning as a response to threat in which the nervous system discovers that the safest strategy is not to fight, not to flee, not to go still, but to become appealing to the source of the threat, to soften yourself, to make yourself agreeable and small and unthreatening, to preemptively manage the other person's emotional state so that the potential displeasure never has the chance to materialize. This was the fourth response, and it was, Walker argued, most commonly found in people who grew up in homes where a parent's anger, withdrawal, or disappointment felt genuinely dangerous. Not necessarily physically dangerous, emotionally dangerous, unpredictable. The kind of home where you never quite knew which version of someone you were going to get. Where the atmosphere could shift without warning from warmth to cold. And where, at some point, you began watching very carefully for signs that a shift was coming. Because if you could see it coming, you could act first. You could apologize before anyone got upset. You could smooth it over before it became a problem. You could take up a little less space. It is worth noting, without excusing anything, that the caregiver in this dynamic was often operating from their own unresolved history. Their emotional unpredictability was usually not a choice, so much as an overflow. That does not make the environment less confusing for a child inside it, but it changes the shape of the story slightly. Two nervous systems, both doing what they were taught, producing a dynamic neither of them fully chose. And on your side of that dynamic, the apology worked. It reduced the threat. Not every time, but enough times for the pattern to get written in. Not a personality trait. A nervous system doing exactly what it was shaped to do. Here is where it becomes more specific. And this is the part that tends to stop people, because it means the habit is not as simple to interrupt as deciding to interrupt it. Research on threat response and early relational stress suggests, and the neuroscience here continues to be refined. So this is an inference grounded in current evidence rather than a settled claim, that brain regions involved in social error monitoring can become sensitized in people who grew up in chronically uncertain emotional environments. One region in particular, the anterior cingulate cortex, sits at the intersection of emotional processing and conflict detection. Its job is to flag moments when something might have gone wrong, when you might have said the wrong thing, when someone's face has shifted, when the temperature in the room has changed. In people who spent their early years in environments where emotional shifts were frequent and the consequences of missing one were real, this monitoring system may become overactive. It begins flagging things that do not warrant flagging. It reads a neutral expression as possible displeasure. It interprets a brief silence as potential withdrawal. It treats ambiguity as threat. Your nervous system may have been doing this since before you had language for it. And when that system fires, the amygdala, the brain's older, faster threat detection center, responds accordingly. Heart rate subtly elevates. A mild stress response mobilizes. The body prepares for social danger, and the brain looks for the fastest available route back to safety. For a nervous system trained in fawn mode, that route is the apology. It is not a choice. It is a reflex, operating below conscious thought, executing a program written somewhere in the past. You do not decide to apologize. By the time the word forms, the decision has already been made. Not by your thinking mind, but by a system that is only trying to protect you. This is the part that willpower almost never touches. You can resolve to stop. You can tell yourself, no more unnecessary sorries. And then someone's expression shifts across the table from you, and the word is out before you've registered that you are even going to say it. Not because you are weak, because the program runs faster than the resolution. There is a finding coming in the next few minutes that reframes exactly what this has been costing you. It is not the finding most people expect, and it changes the way the first half of this looks. Here is the part most people have entirely backwards. The assumption, if you over-apologize, is that the habit is making you safer. It is keeping the peace. It is preventing conflict. It is making people like you. And if there is a cost, the cost is only to you, to your confidence, your sense of worth. You are absorbing the discomfort so that the relationship doesn't have to. In 2023, Karina Schumann, now at the University of Pittsburgh, published research with colleagues Emily Ritchie and Amanda Forrest, examining how frequent apologizers are actually perceived by the people around them. What they found was not a story about generosity wearing itself out. People who apologized very frequently were judged as warmer than those who rarely apologized, more communal, more caring. But they were also consistently judged as lower in agency, less assertive, less confident, less capable of acting on their own behalf. And here's the finding that lands differently from everything before it. When their apologies were reflexive, automatic, meaning depleted, they were not perceived as more sincere than the apologies of infrequent apologizers. They were perceived as the same, or less. Say sorry too many times, and the word stops carrying the signal it was meant to carry. Take a breath. Let that settle. Not damage. Depletion. Which means the threshold you learned, the fawn response that shaped it. The program running faster than thought, none of it was building you a way to connect. It was building you a way to disappear. The warmth others feel towards you is real, but the safety you were buying with every unnecessary sorry was never quite the safety you needed. You have been spending a currency that has been quietly losing its value. There is also what it costs you privately, in the space between the apology and the next breath. Think about the doorway, the automatic sorry for stepping aside, for needing to pass, for existing in a way that might, conceivably, be slightly inconvenient. Every unnecessary apology contains an implicit message, not for the person receiving it, but for you. It says, what I was doing needed to be apologized for. My needs, my presence, my pace, my question. These were things the other person should not have had to deal with. I was in the wrong simply by being. Repeat that message enough times, and it stops feeling like a message. It starts feeling like a fact. Research on self-esteem and chronic apologizing consistently shows the relationship runs in both directions. Low self-worth can drive over-apologizing, but over-apologizing also reinforces and deepens the low self-worth that may have driven it. The two feed each other in a loop that can run for decades. Every sorry you didn't mean chips away at something you may not have known was there until you noticed how thin it had become. And here's the part that tends to produce something specific in people who have lived this pattern for a long time. If you were raised in an environment where your distress was treated as an inconvenience, where your needs were something to manage rather than something to honor, where expressing a preference, a boundary, or even a feeling required a degree of justification that other people's feelings never seemed to need, then the apologetic reflex was not a flaw you developed. It was a reasonable response to an unreasonable demand. You were taught, in the most thorough possible way, that your existence in its full form was too much, that the appropriate size for you was smaller, that the safest version of you was the one who preemptively made herself easier to be around. Not because you were too much, because something in your environment couldn't hold what you were. That distinction matters enormously. One of those is a problem with you. The other is a problem with the environment you were handed. And yet the lesson most often carried forward, quietly, in every unnecessary sorry, is the former. What the research also points toward is what happens when the habit begins to loosen. When you start to work with this pattern, in therapy, through trauma-informed approaches, through the slow process of learning to let a moment pass without filling it with preemptive submission, something unexpected tends to happen first. It is not that you become more assertive. It is not that you suddenly take up more space or stop caring what others feel. Those things can come over time, but they are not the first thing. The first thing, most often, is that you begin to hear yourself more clearly. The chronic apology is a form of noise, constant, low-grade, internal noise, the perpetual monitoring of your own behavior for signs of wrongdoing, the ongoing scan for evidence that you have somehow erred, the reflexive preemptive sorry that fires before anything has even happened. All of that takes bandwidth. It costs something, constantly, just to maintain. And when it's up, begins to quiet, what tends to surface is something you may struggle to name at first. A kind of return, a sense of your own preferences emerging, of noticing, perhaps for the first time in a long time, what you actually want. There is something specific about what happens to the sensitivity itself, the part that was always pointed outward, when the habit begins to quiet. And it is not what most people expect. Therapists working with fawn response patterns, drawing on Pete Walker's framework, and trauma-focused approaches like internal family systems, describe the same thing. You discover, as the habit loosens, that you have opinions, preferences, reactions, needs, not dramatic ones, small, ordinary ones, the kind everyone else seemed to know they had without even thinking about it. The sensitivity that was turned so thoroughly outward, the exquisite attunement to the slightest shift in someone else's face, was never the problem. The problem was only the direction it was pointing. And when the habit quiets, that sensitivity does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes a way of knowing yourself. Studies also suggest that introducing even a brief pause before an automatic sorry, 3 seconds, 5, a moment in which the reflex is allowed to rise without immediately being acted on, begins to create a gap between the stimulus and the response. Not a gap filled with reasoning or willpower. Just a gap. A small pocket of space in which, for a moment, nothing is happening. In that space, sometimes, the apology simply does not come. Not because it was suppressed, because it was not needed. And the nervous system, which has been on alert, finds, sometimes to its own evident surprise, that nothing terrible followed. The moment passed. No one withdrew. The air in the room stayed warm. Each time that happens, the association between social ambiguity and danger loosens, just slightly. Not through insight, through experience, through the body learning, one unremarkable moment at a time. That presence does not require payment. You are standing in a doorway. Someone needs to get past. You step aside. And the silence that follows is just silence. Not a gap to fill. Not a threat to neutralize. Just a moment between two people moving through the same space, neither of whom owes the other anything for it. That is a small thing, but it is not nothing. The nervous system that spent years rehearsing preemptive submission is the same system that learned everything else you know how to do. It learned its lessons quickly and thoroughly, and it can learn this one too, that your presence does not require apology, that your needs are not an imposition, that the space you take up is yours to take. This will not happen because you decided it. It happens in the small accumulated weight of moments in which you allowed yourself to exist without justifying it. The capacity is already there. It was there before the habit, formed over it. It is still there, underneath, waiting for the noise to quiet enough that it can be heard. If this resonated, consider sharing it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. And if you haven't already, subscribing keeps this kind of conversation close for the nights you need it. The apology your nervous system has been rehearsing all this time was never really for anyone else. It was the sound of something small and quiet, trying to stay safe in an environment that did not always make that easy. You can set it down now. You are allowed to simply be here,